Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Oliver Hartwig and I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. They've given me a really easy task tonight to introduce a man who really needs no introduction. John Howard has shaped Australian politics for more than half a century. Having joined the Liberal Party in 1957, he was already involved in the 1963 federal election campaign as a campaign manager. He then ran for the state seat of Des Moines in 1967, which, fortunately, he did not win. I say fortunately, of course, because this meant that instead he pursued a career in federal politics. In 1974, John Howard became the federal member for the Northern Sydney seat of Bennelong, a constituency he came to represent for nearly 33 years. During his time in Australian federal politics, he was Treasurer under Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser from 1977 until 1983. After 13 long and hard years in opposition, with all the ups and downs, John Howard became Australian Prime Minister in 1996, an office he held until 2007. This makes him the second longest serving Australian Prime Minister after Sir Robert Menzies. In a recent opinion poll in Australia, John Howard was voted Australia's best Prime Minister of the past 25 years, and after tonight's events, we of course know why. Remarkably, he won the poll in every age group, and he was the most popular Prime Minister among both male and female voters. His achievements as Prime Minister of Australia are many, among them helping to create one of the best performing economies in the developed world. During his period in office, Australia experienced continued economic growth, averaging 3.6% per annum. Australia had low inflation and interest rates, the lowest unemployment in 30 years, so the creation of around 2 million new jobs and wage increases. Australia's budget was in heavy deficit and debt when John Howard's government came to power. The deficit was eliminated, and 10 out of 12 annual budgets produced by the Howard government were in surplus. 96 billion Australian dollars of debt was repaid, so that when the Howard government left office, the Australian government had no net debt at all. John Howard's government introduced the Goods and Services Tax, reformed the industrial relations system, gradually privatized Telstra, and introduced the principle of mutual obligation to social policy. In the field of foreign policy, the Howard government managed to maintain Australia's traditional allies, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, while at the same time expanding Australia's links with Asia. It is also well known that John Howard is a great friend of New Zealand. In fact, he recently criticized his fellow Australians for being, quote, condescending to New Zealanders and taking the Anzac relationship for granted. Well, we know that Aussies and Kiwis can occasionally clash with each other, not just on the rugby pitch, but also over such existential questions like who really invented pavlova. But deep down, I believe we all know what a special relationship it is that binds Australia and New Zealand together. And therefore, we are very grateful, Prime Minister, that you have accepted our invitation to speak to us tonight on this very topic. We look forward to hearing from you about how to continue, strengthen, and maybe recalibrate the Trans-Tasman relationship in a century which we all expect to be dominated by the Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a great friend of New Zealand, former Australian Prime Minister John Howard.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, for that very generous introduction. I first of all thank Mr. Thorburn and Mr. Partridge in particular for sponsoring and helping my visit here. I look around the room and I'm conscious that present are a number of people who've played a very major role in the political and economic development of this country over a long period of time. And I'm especially thinking of Ruth Richardson and Bill Birch, both of whom who played... I mean, it is very important at a gathering like this to recall the extraordinary example that New Zealand represented in the 1980s and the early 1990s of economic reform and change around the world. New Zealand was a trailblazer. We do have a GST, but it's not as good as the New Zealand GST. And you can thank the Labor Party and the Australian Democrats in the Senate for that. because we won a decent GST election in 1998, and it was virtually a mirror image, not quite, pretty close to a mirror image of the New Zealand GST, but of course, despite the public having voted for it, those who control the numbers in the upper house decided to take it out. So my moral out of all of this is that you may have MMP but don't have a second chamber. Because once you've got a second chamber, I'm not suggesting we should get rid of the Australian Senate. It was the Australian Labor Party that used to believe in getting rid of the Australian Senate, and they find it actually had some useful purposes. And on the subject of that, can I say that the last time the Australian Labor Party had a leadership crisis, in fact the occasion when Julia Gillard replaced Kevin Rudd, I found myself out of the country. Although the circumstances were less congenial then than they are tonight. I was at Harare Airport in Zimbabwe, having escaped the jurisdiction of my very good friend and old enemy, Robert Mugabe, and I learnt then of that travail. But I'll say just something very briefly about the Australian political scene at the end of my remarks. But tonight I did very genuinely want to remark upon the importance of what are now generically referred to as think tanks in the political firmament of democracies like Australia and New Zealand. Oliver reminded you that I'd entered Parliament in 1974. In 1974, and through until I think the middle of the 1980s, when the Centre of Independent Studies, which is the organisation that Oliver was associated with until recently, came on the scene. Until then, economic advice to the government was monopolised even more heavily by the Federal Treasury and the Reserve Bank, even more heavily then than it continues to be the case. Now, I have a lot of respect for the Federal Treasury in Australia and the Reserve Bank. I think one of the good things about our country and your country is that the global financial crisis revealed well-run, well-regulated and prudentially supervised banking systems in both countries. That was one of the reasons why we were able to come through the global financial crisis relatively unscathed as far as our institutions were concerned. But it's always struck me as faintly ironic that Treasury bureaucrats in most countries rail against monopolies of advice and activity in every field except the provision of advice to governments, when of course the maintenance of that advice remains something that's absolutely essential to the national interest. But the importance of think tanks is that they provide a level and a capacity for the contestability of advice and ideas to government that goes beyond the normal rigour and quality of advice that flows from the public service. And I can certainly testify from my own experience as Treasurer, and most particularly in the barren, terrible 13 years of opposition. And opposition is a soul-destroying experience, and each year it gets worse, and it goes on. And we had 13 years of it, and I suppose the only thing that sustained me during that 13-year period, the thing that really did sustain me, was the ferment of ideas and the debate on ideas that took place during those years. And that was greatly aided by the debate that was then emerging in Australia about the potential deregulation of the labour market. Australia still has and has again embraced a highly regulated labour market. And until the middle 1980s, after we had been voted out and Bob Hawke had become Prime Minister, it had been a bipartisan constant of Australian politics that you had a centralised wage fixation system. We talked about the Industrial Relations Club And the Industrial Relations Club was a cosy tripartite understanding between the leadership of the government, the leadership of large corporations, and the leadership of the trade union movement. And that was a view that was held by both sides of Australian politics. The great Sir Robert Menzies, after he retired in 1967, delivered some lectures at a university in the United States, and he talked about Australia's system of wage fixation, when we had a Commonwealth and Conciliation and Arbitration Commission. And he said, and I've never forgotten when the words after I'd read them some years ago, he said, in Australia, we don't leave such matters as wage levels and conditions of work to a political debate or a political auction. We entrust those weighty and important matters to the adjudication of our Arbitration Commission. And we leave it to the judges of the Arbitration Commission to deliberate on these matters. Now, when I read those words, they sounded quaint, they sounded odd, they sounded completely as though they belonged to another world. But it was an illustration, and I paraphrase him but slightly. It is an illustration of just how wedded both sides of politics in Australia were to a controlled and centralised wage fixing system. Now, not being a federation, of course, things were a little different in New Zealand, but it really wasn't until the government of which Ruth was a member came along that seriously the labour market in this country was deregulated. Now, the most productive years in many ways that I had in politics in Australia when it came to policy making were the years that I had in opposition. And I had the responsibility of both when I was Deputy Leader of the Opposition and then naturally for a period of time as Leader, and I had a couple of periods as Leader of the Opposition, but I won't go into that. And it's just all part and parcel of the ups and downs of Australian politics. But the responsibility I had and the interest I had in labour market reform sustained me. And what helped to sustain me was the contribution that was made to that debate by think tanks, because they had worked out ahead of the political parties and had worked out ahead of the government's advisors and certainly ahead of the leadership of many of the larger business organisations or many of the organisations representing larger corporations. They had worked out that a centralised wage fixing system was going to hold Australia back. And the experience of working with those think tanks, like the CES and the research department or research sections of the National Farmers Federation, who became very strong advocates of labour market reform, partly because of the incredibly damaging impact of the practices of the maritime unions on Australia's export industries. The experience of interacting with them not only gave me a tremendous intellectual input, but the excitement of the economic debate and the feeling that we were taking part in a debate about the economic future of Australia, and that we had an opportunity of building on some of the reforms which, to its great credit, the Labor government led by Bob Hawke had carried out in areas such as financial deregulation, and which had the very strong support of the opposition in those years. So I want to commend to you very strongly, not because the organisation has invited me here tonight, because I believe very strongly that politics, whether it is in Australia or in New Zealand, politics above everything else is a battle and a debate about ideas and about values. And the things that make political parties relevant and sustain support for them and sustain enthusiasm amongst their members is a debate about ideas and a debate about values. And it's always important to renew that debate. I often liken the process of economic reform to a never-ending foot race. a foot race towards an ever-receding line. You never get there and you never win it, but the problem is that if you slow up, the bloke beside you will surge past. And that is a challenge that a nation faces, a challenge that Australia faces, a challenge that New Zealand faces. Our country is very richly endowed by Providence with lots of resources, but we run the danger, Australia runs the danger of being complacent about that, of assuming that because China has large resources, a large demand for resources, and we still have the fortunate circumstance that Japan takes 20% of our exports, that demand and the opportunities it presents will always be there, but it's not a given. Our costs are edging up. Our labour market has been heavily re-regulated by the current government, which is a terrible mistake. It's the first time in the last 25 years that we've seen a major economic reform reversed. Australia's had 5 major economic reforms in the last 30 years. Like New Zealand, we embraced taxation reform, we've cut tariffs, we've privatised government industries, and we've also reformed the labour market only to make the terrible mistake of reversing that reform. So we can't assume that that resource endowment will always be our economic meal ticket, and we have to maintain that rather challenging and never-ending foot race towards that ever-receding line, because we do run the risk of falling behind. Can I just say that as I look around the world economically, it does present a very mixed picture. Europe, I think, will remain very sluggish economically for a considerable time into the future. Not because I draw upon the strong anger of any Australian or New Zealand political leader towards the terrible impact on our efficient farmers of the Common Agricultural Policy, not only because of that, but I certainly don't exclude it, but I've always been something of a sceptic about the European Union. Of course, the euro was fatally flawed from the very beginning when it sought to have a monetary union without a fiscal union. And I suppose the reason it didn't have a fiscal union was because that was unattainable. I don't believe that the legislature of France or Germany or Britain, although Britain's not in the euro, or indeed of Italy, and we've even seen it more recently in relation to a country as tiny as Cyprus. I don't think their legislatures and their publics are going to surrender control over expenditure and taxation decisions to an international organisation. We all know how unaccountable domestic bureaucracies can become, but there is no more unaccountable beast in the world than an international bureaucracy. And that, of course, is what so much of the European Union has become. But leaving that aside, that is a problem for the Europeans, and that's their destiny and that's their challenge. But it does have an impact on the rest of the world. And as I look around at Europe and the other parts economically of the world, one sees a different picture. I'm an optimist about what is going to happen in the United States. We hear a lot about the fiscal cliff, and obviously the United States has a very challenging difficulty, has a great difficulty ahead of it in relation to its soaring government debt and its expenditures. I think the United States system of government is increasingly ill-suited to a lot of the challenges that that country has. But it doesn't alter the fact that the American economy is still an extremely aggressive and, compared with the rest of the world, lightly regulated animal. The great thing about the United States is that if they see a game-changing opportunity, they grab it. I mean, can I draw your attention to what's happened in relation to the extraction of gas and oil from shale? According to the World Energy Agency, by 2020, the oil exports of the United States will equal those of Saudi Arabia. That the way in which the costs of many manufacturing industries in the United States have been reduced by the way in which they've extracted oil and gas from shale is an illustration of that. And I can recall in the discussions I had with both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration when I was Prime Minister, just how haunted the United States was by her energy dependence on the Middle East. And if as a result of this game changer in relation to energy, the United States can reduce her energy dependency on the Middle East, it will liberate her foreign policy as much as it will give her economic advantage and economic preferment. I mention that as an illustration of the way in which the United States has that great capacity when an economic opportunity presents itself to actually do something about it. The American laws in relation to resource exploitation are different from ours. The minerals in the United States are not reserved to the Crown or whatever the Republican equivalent is of reserving minerals to the Crown. They, of course, are in the hands of the landowner. It's a different land use practice that the United States has. But the point simply is that the American economy is still geared to the exploitation of an opportunity in a way in which few economies around the world really are. I read an article in The Economist last week indicating that investment at the present time in research and development in the United States is the highest it's been for more than 50 years. And the thrust of that analysis was that despite the bickering and the problems in Washington, large parts of the American economy, taking advantage of the flexibility of a federal system, were actually getting on with the job of economic recovery. And that, of course, brings us back to our own region, the Asian region, the Pacific region, or the Asian Pacific region. Now, we all know, because we've been told it frequently enough, and in Australia we've had a white paper on it, which tells us that this is the Asian century, as if Asia was discovered in the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, I can remember, and I'm old enough to remember that back in 1957, the then Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, John or Blackjack McEwen, who had a reputation as being a fearsome and aggressive protectionist and a powerful advocate for Australia's farmers, negotiated a commerce agreement with Japan. Negotiating a commerce agreement with Japan in 1957 in Australia was a relatively courageous thing to have done. It was only 12 years after World War II, and of course the memories of the maltreatment of Australian and other Allied prisoners of war at the hands of the Japanese was still very, very bitterly remembered in our country. And he, for his pains, was attacked by both the RSL, the representatives of the returned servicemen, and also, I should remind you, of the Australian Labor Party, which was then in opposition, led by Dr. Evatt. But the point I make is that Asia's been around for a long time, and it hasn't been discovered over the last few years. And indeed, we actually had a trade representative in Tokyo before World War II, having been appointed by Bob Menzies during the first and very brief period of time that he was Prime Minister. But that's just a little bit of partisan political history that I shouldn't have entreated into such a bipartisan gathering. But if I can just put that aside for the moment, the point is seriously made that we have enormous opportunities, and I do want to record the fact that every Australian Prime Minister, irrespective of his or her political stripe over the last 40 years, has recognised that our first and most important economic interaction is with the nations of Asia. The extraordinary economic miracle of China is not only good for China, it's very good for the world. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in that country, and it's made a great contribution to the economic growth of a number of neighbouring countries. And China is, of course, Australia's best customer. And in the time that I was Prime Minister, and I don't for a moment claim that it was entirely due to my government's policy, was the conjunction of that, but also of the economic circumstances of the time, that our exports to China more than quadrupled during a period of 10 or 12 years. Now, Providence was very kind with all those resources we were given, and they are sold in abundance. I think it's very important, though, that neither Australia nor New Zealand, or indeed the rest of the world, becomes mesmerised by China. China is the second largest economy in the world, but she occupies that position by dint of her enormous population. If you look at per capita GDP, which is the more accurate way of measuring wealth, China's per capita GDP is barely a tenth of what it is in nations such as Australia and New Zealand and the United States and many of the countries of Northern Europe. China has enormous domestic challenges. The new Chinese leadership will be totally preoccupied with dealing with those domestic challenges. Her two greatest challenges are, of course, demography and democracy. To use a cliche, China will grow old before she grows rich. And the impact of the one-child policy will mean that for decades into the future, increasing volumes of resources in China will need to be devoted to looking after an ageing population rather than being invested in other activities. And you can't change that. It'll be the mixing metaphors, will be the slowest turning ocean liner imaginable. It'll be a very long time before that policy, even if it is changed, and it's being slowly changed at the edges, will be turned around. The other challenge, of course, is China's future governance. I hold very much to the view that a generation of Chinese who are experiencing for the first time being part of the middle class will be very happy to put up with being told what to do when it comes to politics, because they're enjoying enrichment they never imagined they would. But I think their children will have a very different attitude. Their children will take the enrichment for granted, and they will want to say in how the affairs of their country are run. And none of this is to suggest for a moment that the Chinese economic miracle is suddenly going to go into reverse. But I do think it's important that we keep in perspective the rise of China. I don't think we should fall for these absurd propositions that some kind of inevitable conflict between China and the United States is going to occur in our part of the world. And of course, the foreign policies of both of our countries should be directed towards ensuring that the United States and China cooperate as closely as they possibly can. The reality is that China is too preoccupied with her own internal affairs to want to pick a fight with the United States or indeed any other country, although there is always the danger, as we've seen from history, that conflict between countries, and I think here of China and Japan over those islands, can occur almost by accident rather than by design. But the preoccupation of the Chinese leadership is going to be very much upon ensuring that those domestic challenges and the like are met. Can I just, because I know you may be interested in my views, can I just say one or two things about politics in Australia? It's been an interesting day in Australia, and we always try to provide a little bit of sport and rivalry and all those sorts of things. It has been an interesting day in Australian politics. I think that what's happened today has further cemented the view in the Australian public that the current government is not very competent. I think the Australian Labor Party, and I say this with all seriousness, made a terrible mistake in removing Kevin Rudd in 2010. I mean, just think about it. Whether you're a Labor supporter or a National supporter or neither, or a Liberal supporter in Australia or an ALP supporter, just think about it. You're in opposition for 12 years and you try 5 opposition leaders and you finally get hold of one that gets rid of that terrible fellow Howard. And what do after you've done that? You give him 2.5 years and then you throw him out without him ever having had an opportunity of going back to the electorate as Prime Minister. Now, one of the problems with politics in both our countries, well, let me say in Australia, I shouldn't presume to speak for New Zealand, but I can't imagine things are any different, is that there can develop this disconnect between the views and opinions of the beltway, as the Americans call it, the people who surround the beehive or the hill or whatever description you want to use, and the rest of the community. And the people in that inner circle may have a view about somebody, and that may colour their attitude towards him or her, but as far as the general public is concerned, it has an entirely different view. And the general public in 2010 may have been cranky with Mr Rudd about a number of things, but they certainly didn't think it was a very sensible idea for him to be removed before he'd had the opportunity of facing the people. And of course the truth is that although we don't have a presidential system in this country, or indeed in my country, you do know the government of the day by the name of the Prime Minister. I led the Howard government, John Key leads the Key government, and Helen Clark led the Clark Labor government, and so it goes on. And people actually say, well, if they're going to change the leader, I want to have a say in that. And if they deny that opportunity, they get very cranky, and I think it's a lesson that we should remember. And we're going to have an election on the 14th of September. I suspect that there will be a change of government. The polls indicate that. I think the merits of what has occurred over the last 5 years suggest that that should happen. It will be a very considerable achievement for Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott almost pulled off something that's only happened once in 110 years of the Australian Federation, and that is the defeat of a government after only one term. And the only time it's ever happened in Australia was the defeat of the Scullin Labor government in 1931 in the depths of the Great Depression, when every government was going through a very great difficulty. So we shall see, and no doubt we will have a very interesting few months. And I'm very optimistic that a government led by Tony Abbott will reflect many of the views and the values of organisations such as the New Zealand Initiative and their companion and sister organisations in Australia. The last thing I want to say is about the relationship between our two countries. It is true that I put a lot of effort into the bilateral relationship between Australia and New Zealand. I thought it had been a bit neglected and taken for granted, and I've always been impressed with Dr. Johnson's injunction that we should keep our friendships in good repair. And I felt that on occasion we didn't keep those friendships in good repair. And we rather took the view that it would just bump along. I tried very hard in the dealings I had with 3 New Zealand Prime Ministers. First of all, Jim Bolger, then Jenny Shipley for a brief period of time, and then for most of the time with Helen Clark. I tried very hard, and I hope with some success, to ensure that any ideological differences that may have existed, and there were obviously some between me and Helen Clark on certain issues, that those issues did not come between the pursuit by both of us of the national interests and the combined interests of the two countries. And I think we had some success. CER, which of course was the creation of an earlier coalition government, particularly the initiative of Doug Anthony, the leader of the National Party in Australia, and his New Zealand counterpart. CER has grown in a quite impressive way, and all of us have an obligation to build further on it. and the cooperation between our two countries has become better and stronger as the years have gone by as a result of that. And I do want to pay tribute to Doug and those in the then New Zealand government who worked very hard on that. But I think we can see that the Trans-Tasman relationship is in good shape. You continue to keep a sense of perspective amongst Australian rugby followers. You had an absolutely magnificent Olympic Games in London, and to use that boxing expression on a pound-for-pound basis, you outperformed us in London, and all credit and congratulations to you. But most importantly, it should be the obligation of successive governments in Australia and New Zealand to keep the relationship on the sort of footing that it is at present. I first met John Key when I was Prime Minister and he was Leader of the Opposition, and I was impressed then. I was particularly impressed that a man who'd had such a remarkable career internationally in banking should decide at that stage in his life to devote himself to public service and to politics. And in the time that's gone by, he's continued to impress me. I think he brings balance and common sense to the leadership of this country. I'm naturally a political ally of his, and many of the things that he stands for and the many of the things that he says are things that I stand for and which I say. But he does bring a maturity and an energy to the leadership of this country, which I can tell you many Australians are deeply impressed by. And as I look around the world and look around the English-speaking world, and for Conservative leaders, I think of people like John Key, and I think of Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada, who won a terrific victory at the last election because he stood out against the climate change zealots who would hobble the capacity of nations such as Canada, rich in resources, to take advantage of those resources. So long may John continue as Prime Minister of this country, and very importantly, long may the New Zealand Initiative continue to do what think tanks do best of all, and that is keep the feet of the political leaders to the fire of necessary economic reform. You won't ever get everything you want from governments. That's impossible. I used to say when I was Prime Minister in my cabinet, we were debating the political impact of something, I would say that it was better to be 80% pure in opposition than 80% pure in government than 125% pure in opposition. In other words, you had to achieve a balance. You had to pay some deference to political reactions to your policies. But if you fell below 80% in the level of policy purity, well, perhaps you were heading in the wrong direction. So I'd say to Oliver and his colleagues, if you can get 80% out of the government, if you can get feet to the fire and 80% results, you're doing very well. And but you deserve that because the sort of values that your newly merged organisation are articulating are the values that are important to New Zealand and Australia, both remaining very competitive in that never-ending foot race. Thank you.